Welcome to the Future of ATO in Jasmine with Philip Martin. Before we begin, a couple of brief notes. You can stop by the business hall. It's located in Mandalay Bay, Oceanside, and the Shoreline Ballrooms on level 2. The Black Hat Arsenal is in the business hall on level 2 as well. There's a merchandise store on level 2, and there are session recordings available for all the sessions for all of the Black Hat. There are offices on every level for that. Thanks for putting your cell phones on vibrate. It makes it easier for the rest of us to ignore the text messages that you're ignoring at the moment. With that, I'd like to ask you to help me to invite Philip to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks. Get this thing hooked up here and get on our way. Outstanding, computers work. What do you know? Afternoon, folks. Thanks for coming. Really appreciate it on this sort of second to last slot of Black Hats. I'm gonna start with the bad news first, which is if you're here with like bated breath, waiting to learn about the future of authorities to operate, you're in the wrong room. And that's not, this is one of two venues that joke plays at all. It's here in Shmoo, nowhere else. So what we're gonna talk about is the future, from my perspective, of account takeover in sort of consumer-facing platforms. As Coinbase, as a cryptocurrency company, and just a quick show of hands, who here knows Coinbase? Nice, target market right here in this room. That's outstanding. So as a cryptocurrency company, we see some of the most targeted, high-effort, motivated, persistent ATO in the world, from my perspective. Over the past 3.5 years that I've been at Coinbase, I've started to see stuff that I first saw coming at us trickle down and make it to other parts of the broader industry, which was really the genesis for this talk, which was talking a bit about how we day-to-day see account takeover, how we've sort of built to protect our customers from it, with the goal of giving you guys a view into the stuff that might end up on your plate one day, and B, some ideas about how we've tackled the challenge. I make no bones about, we're not perfect. I'm sure there are things that we don't do that we should, and I'm sure there are improvements that's probably some of you guys in this room are going to make on ways to detect and counter account takeovers. But I want to provide sort of through our lens what we think the future looks like. I'll start very briefly with me. I'm the CISO at Coinbase. Like I said, about 3.5 years at Coinbase, which is something like 3,500 years in crypto years, cryptocurrency years. Sorry for any of you purists in the audience. So you guys know Coinbase by and large, right? Brokerage, exchange, custodian. The other way I sometimes like to refer to Coinbase is the world's largest capture the flag. With nothing? Guys, wake up, come on. Thank you. So we have about 30 million users all around the globe. Literally almost every country in the world. We're in 103 countries. And what that means is we have a very diverse user population. Geographically diverse in age, diverse in experience, which makes some of our messaging, I'm gonna talk a little bit about security communication near the end, which makes it particularly challenging and interesting. So we're going to start structurally with sort of an overview of the ATO landscape. We're going to move sort of technique by technique into what are we seeing that's interesting, what about it is interesting, right? Some of these techniques up there, credential stuffing, we all know credential stuffing, talking about sort of what we're doing to counter that and some of the interesting twists we see attackers starting to bring to the table given our countermeasures. I'm going to leave 5 to 10 minutes at the end for questions. So please save your questions for that. There's 2 microphones in the aisles down the side that we'll use if you guys have questions. And that's it. So let's learn a little bit about the broad ATO landscape first, and then we'll sort of dig into the individual pieces. So we're going to be talking about both what we call targeted ATO and untargeted ATO. On our platform, we see about 10% of the ATO attempts that we see, we judge as targeted. That's 10% leaving out the like 50 billion credential stuffing attempts that have been made in the past probably 32 seconds. So over and above that sort of floor level of noise, about 10% for the remaining stuff, we talk about as targeted. And so what does that mean? Targeted ATO for us is about the efforts and about the persistence, right? It's high effort, high reward. These attackers are researching their targets, their victims, fairly in depth. These attackers are actively pivoting around, right? They don't let themselves be blocked and move on to a new target. If they encounter a blocker in their attack, they're going to try to pivot their way around it within that same target. The attackers want targeted attacks especially tend to focus on target centers of gravity first. Email accounts are very, very popular. We're starting to see more and more online file sharing accounts being Dropbox, Box, things like that. Also being sort of regarded by these guys as centers of gravity. They start there, they get their toehold, and they pivot around your target's sort of online life. And by the time they get to where they're going to steal money, whether that be Coinbase or anywhere else, they're generally in possession of the target's email. They're generally in possession of, if they have online file sharing, they're in that. They're in the social media. There's really a fairly thorough compromise that occurs before the attacker moves on to actually their intended actions around, mostly around stealing money, right? Untargeted ATO is the exact opposite, right? This is low to moderate effort. This is low to no reward. These attackers have little to no idea about the identity of who they're attacking. They don't really care, right? They're operating off of maybe a dump or some other list they scraped from somewhere. If they encounter a roadblock, if they run into something they weren't expecting, they just move on to the next name, right? They don't really care. They're not tied to any one target, and they're not looking for a big payday. They're the ones who are grinding this out over a large number of users, right? So in general, in our view here, and we'll talk through the specifics in the rest of the presentation, but in general, our view is that is a two-factor, even SMS two-factor for the vast majority of people is effective against untargeted ATO, right? There's some caveats in there that I'll get into a little bit later, but in general, versus untargeted ATO, we see SMS 2FA and of course TUTP or U2F, which we also support, as effective versus those two things, right? For targeted ATO, that is not the case. And in fact, we see in targeted ATO's cases, both SMS and TOTP, we see attackers finding ways around, over, or through in various ways. And again, we'll get more into depth in sort of the case-by-case thing there. For what it's worth, our results look exactly like Google's. The U2F or WebAuthn survives across the board extremely well. That is our recommendation for 2FA, and across the board is very, very, very effective against everything but social engineering, which isn't really a technical bypass of that in any case. Fortunately, as I mentioned, so the majority of people, and even in cryptocurrency, the majority of people are not the victim of a targeted ATO. Right? There are obvious risk factors. Are you tweeting about your cryptocurrency? Are you taking pictures standing next to a big Bitcoin symbol? Are you engaged in public discourse in cryptocurrency? Are you sort of creating that trail, that OSINT trail that an attacker can find and say, oh, this person probably has crypto, I should target them for a high effort ATO, right? If you're doing that, then my argument would be you should be using U2F. If you're not, and if you're not that easy to OSINT out, and if you're not likely to put on a target list, SMS works quite well at this point. Okay? I am basically entirely positive that I will get questions about that topic at the end. So feel free to bring that on. Now let's talk about sort of go from the overall view, like how is ATO happening generally. Let's talk about a little bit about sort of who is executing ATO, and then we're going to get into the meat of the presentation, like how are they doing it, right? So we see everything from solo attackers all the way up to transnational criminal organizations, and even some sort of smaller nation states. North Korea is a good example of a nation state that's involved in the crypto space. These attackers in this space are generally economically rational. They're not ideological, and they're not looking for things other than money, like information or access, which is great because these attackers are looking to make a profit. They, formally or informally, they're looking at a profit and loss statement on their activities, right? Which, from a defender's perspective, gives me a nice entry point to start to impact or get inside their decision cycle. Most attacker groups that we see operating in the space today are one or two trick ponies. They find a technique that works, they work that technique till it's not working anymore, they find a new one, they go with that. They're generally not executing sort of a full spectrum of ATO within a single group. There are a few exceptions to that, but in general. And then I'll say, with the heavy caveat that I'll mention at the end, most of the groups that we're identifying tend to be located in places like Nigeria, Philippines, other places in Africa, some in Eastern Europe, relatively low cost, which again goes back to that profit and loss statement, means that a relatively small, to us, payday may be financing their operations for actually quite a long time to come. Right? Now I'll caveat this heavily, which is the more accurate statement is that probably attacker groups with poor OPSEC tend to be located in lower cost countries, right? Because those are the ones where we're actually been able to do attribution, walk it back, and actually get a good idea where these folks are from. So first up, my favorites, the perennial SIM swapping and phone porting. So I'll talk really quickly about this at a high level. I'm not going to go into detail on like what each of these are. But at a high level, right, phone porting is the act of moving a phone number from company A to from phone company A to phone company B, right? It's high effort. It takes a long time to move. It takes a long time to move it back. It's relatively as these things go, it's relatively easy to detect because this porting information is fairly easy to access if you go find the right data sources. But it's also very hard to undo, right? We've seen average porting undo times in the weeks, which is really painful if you're the victim, right? SIM swapping, on the other hand, much faster, much sort of lower bar, both to do and to undo. SIM swapping is keeping the phone number within the same company, within the same account, but just attaching a new SIM to that phone number, right? It goes from the victim SIM to the attacker SIM, and suddenly the attacker is getting your SMS messages and receiving your calls. Back in the beginning, about 3 years ago when I first started at Coinbase, it was almost purely phone porting is what we saw, which has its pluses and minuses for attackers. Today, we see almost exclusively SIM swapping. Phone porting still happens, but not nearly as frequently. And I think one of the reasons is because we see attackers compressing their attack timelines significantly. So we see today SIMs being swapped and unswapped within 15 to 20 minutes. These activities time for when their victim is likely asleep based on their time zone. Right, so what happens, right, when you get a SIM swap or when you get a phone port, in general, the first thing you know is that your bars go to zero, and you're like, what happened? You call the phone company and they say, oh yeah, you moved your service, and you say, no, I didn't, and then a large argument starts, right? With SIM swapping, because they can do it very quickly, they can swap it over, do what they're going to do, swap it back, and you may not even know this occurred until the attacker is abusing the access they gained, right? So you can't do that with phone porting. Numbers just don't move that quickly between companies, which is why we think we see this concentration in SIM swapping in particular. Let's see. So SIM swapping is interesting because it's a fairly high reward technique, and is used frequently both in 2FA bypasses, but more and more we see it used in account recovery bypasses. We're going to talk about this as a separate topic. But more and more we see that as the vector that SimSwap is being used to gain access to accounts through, as opposed to straight sort of 2FA code stealing. Now the reason this is sort of high effort or high risk, high reward is because in order to execute that SIM swap, depending on which phone company is involved, you're doing one of social engineering. You may be going to a physical store as an attacker, showing a fake ID, or you may be coercing, blackmailing, bribing, whatever, a phone company employee into doing that activity for you. What I've seen over the past 3 years is a number of groups will start using this technique. We'll ramp up activities, do it enough so that the FBI gets interested. The FBI arrests them all. SIM swapping goes way down. And then another group gets interested, SIM swapping goes back up, and this cycle has repeated at least 3 times. These are just a few of the different headlines on sort of the various groups that have been involved here over time. So fortunately, there's actually quite a bit of stuff we can do to mitigate SIM swapping and phone porting. The number one thing we can do for this, as I mentioned up front, if a user is a target for this, right? And again, most users aren't, but if a user is a target for this, the best technique is to move off of SMS 2FA, right? Move to TOTP or U2F for the preference in U2F. As anyone who's run a large consumer site knows, this is incredibly hard to get users to move sort of up the value pyramid, if you will, for 2FA. There's a couple of things, we've tried a bunch of stuff over the course of time. And I should preface this with, Coinbase is probably the largest platform I know of that requires 100% 2FA. Every single account in Coinbase has 2FA. You don't get a choice. We don't let you decide not to have 2FA. We let you decide what kind of 2FA to have, right? So our challenge is not enrolling in 2FA, our challenge is getting users to move up into more secure 2FA. What we found is we started with emails and said, we emailed users, say, hey, upgrade to 2FA. We did a bunch of A/B testing on like how to talk to users, what message, is it scary? Is it you're falling behind your peers? Is it your funds are at risk? Like how do we talk about it? And the very best conversion rate we got was about 3% from emails, right? It's atrocious, that's terrible. So we said, okay, maybe email's not gonna work because there's deliverability issues, people don't open emails, whatever. So let's do some in-app work. So we tried a couple different things. We tried a banner in the app that says, hey, please upgrade your 2FA. Again, we played with the wording, we played with the urgency, and we got it up to about 10% conversion, which is pretty solid. But we wanted to get it better. So my recommendation, if you're looking to get users to enroll in better 2FA, is to annoy them. So what we actually landed on here was once you cross a certain risk threshold as a Coinbase user using SMS 2FA, every time you log into Coinbase, you were dropped into a 2FA upgrade flow, right? And you can close it out, you can skip it if you want to, but every time you relog in, every time you log in, you see that same flow over and over and over and over until one day, out of sheer annoyance, you just do it, right? And that has been incredibly effective at getting people to move from SMS to TOTP and over time into U2F, right? So the second broad area is, there are companies that do have access to things like phone porting feeds and SIM swap feeds. It's not 100%, it's not a panacea. This isn't like a feed you subscribe to and you never have a phone porting or SIM swap event again, but it does help, and it helps immensely. If this is a problem you guys are struggling with, you want some recommendations, come grab me after. Happy to talk through sort of exactly what we use and how we leverage it a bit more. Let's see, what's the last thing? Lastly, this is sort of echoing what I said before. Our firm belief is that any 2FA is better than no 2FA, right? Because we see the vast majority of attacks in this space are things like credential stuffing or other untargeted attacks that are relatively low effort, and SMS 2FA is enough of a bump in the road to derail those attacks, right? In a way that a pure password wouldn't be, right? That said, if that phone porting SIM swapping attack is in your threat model, there is no panacea to prevent this, either on our side as a platform or on the phone company's side. The only safe thing if your target is to get off of SMS. Account recovery abuse. So funny story about this slide. I was looking for graphics to include here, and I was like, okay, I'll just grab a screenshot of like some platform's account recovery flow. And then I was thinking through that, and I'm like, okay, well, which platform am I going to call out in my Black Hat talk on stage in Vegas? And I said, you know what? Maybe the better idea is just get a generic image of an eye looking through a keyhole. That's probably the smarter move. So you get the eye looking through a keyhole that doesn't really make sense in this context, but that's fine. So originally, phone porting SIM swapping was something that we saw used to bypass 2FA directly, right? The common case was credential reuse, attacker gets it, tries to log in, gets a 2FA prompt, goes into their PII archive for this user, executes a port or a swap. Leverages that to get the code, logs in, right? Today, we see the primary use of SIM swapping and phone porting being used in account recovery bypasses for third-party accounts. email providers, file storage providers, that kind of thing. Because a lot of these platforms, and I think this is a huge and underreported problem in the industry, a lot of these platforms, their account recovery method basically devolves to SMS. Right? As long as you can receive a text with your account recovery code, you can gain access back to your account. That account recovery process resets both the password and the 2FA at the same time, right? Effectively saying, yes, you set up your password and your 2F, and you have these great practices, and you're not reusing your password, but because the account recovery depends on SMS, a simple phone port or SIM swap can result in that account compromise, right? It's sort of easy to throw rocks at that, right? And say, oh my gosh, flip a table. What in the world are these platforms doing? Why are they using SMS? It turns out this is actually like a pretty hard problem. Like the core problem here is, how do we authenticate a user when they've forgotten the things that we use to authenticate them? Right? Which when you start to dive down that rabbit hole and go into, okay, well, what can we use? What is a durable thing that we both know or that we both can access that we can use to establish identity, right? And it's pretty tough, right? We've gone as an industry from KDA to SMS or recovery codes, and like nothing's, in my opinion, nothing's great. I don't think we have a great solution either, but I will pitch sort of what we do differently and what I would recommend other folks think about. We do 3 core things, right? Number one, Coinbase has all the same know your customer requirements as a bank, right? We have to get ID up front and all sorts of fun stuff. So what we decided to do was actually inject an additional ID verification in the account recovery flow, right? We already have a copy of it. We got a copy when you're registered. We push you back through that same flow, compare the IDs, compare the selfies, make sure that this is actually you, make sure it's not a resubmission, a few other corner cases. And we feel like that gives us, and really we have the evidence to say that is enough of a roadblock at this point to cause attackers to go somewhere else and not try to push down that rabbit hole. Now, with the proliferation of KYC leaks, I think a really interesting sort of problem with this is going to be deepfakes, and the deepfakes' ability to both bypass liveness detection on a lot of these sort of KYC apps, as well as generate this stuff in a really believable, effective way. So I don't think it's like I said, I don't think it's a panacea, but it's an approach that's worked extremely well for us so far. The second thing we do is we separate out password recovery from 2FA reset. Those are 2 separate processes that have different requirements, right? So that an attacker has to go through both of those things to get full access. They don't get one and done and reset all the protections you had. The third thing we do is we inject delays. All right, so one of our default ways that we try to mitigate events that are high-risk situations is we say, okay, we're going to inject 48-hour cooling off period, and we're going to message you on email, text, everything we know about you. We're going to send you a message and say like, hey, we're delaying this for this reason. If this wasn't you, we're going to give you a really easy way to say this wasn't me and cancel whatever activity that was, whether it's account reset or an unauthorized send. We do this in a few different places. This is again, in my opinion, underused, but a great control in general, and makes even targeted attackers have a really, really hard time, right? Because you're essentially saying, okay, not only do you have to do this once, you now have to stay. You have to stay in this person's account for 48 hours before you actually are getting what you want to do, right? Which is more than most of them actually can or want to do. Credential phishing, this is nothing new. This has been around since forever. A couple of interesting refinements that we see our attackers using. Number one, all the phish kits that target Coinbase have integrated 2FA phases as well. So they're taking username, password. They're asking for 2FA token. We require 2FA tokens for several in-app actions as well. So things like sending money or a few other things. And so what we actually see is them integrating fake failures in their 2FA collection as well. They'll say, give me your username, password, great, give me your 2FA code. Oh, that one didn't work, try the next one, right? And they'll do that as many times as they need to collect the number of 2FA codes they need to perform actions on Coinbase. We also see them, traditionally, this kind of credential phishing, the creds would go into a text file somewhere or into an email address that the attacker would collect later, right? We see them again, modern phishing kits in real time using the credentials that they've harvested to reach out to Coinbase on the back end and do whatever it is that they're trying to do. So as you hit enter on that username password, they're making an API call to Coinbase to say, okay, I want to do this thing. As you submit that 2FA token, they're using it immediately on the back end. So the cycle, right, is much shorter and much harder for a user to take any action after they lose their credentials. So what do we do? While we still see like a pretty decent volume of attempted credential theft, we see almost no success from the attackers. The primary reason is we have it's the wrong screenshot. We have a device verification flow. So when you log in from a new device, what we require is an email-based workflow. We send you an email. We say, hey, this is a new device. We don't know it yet. Click here to say it's good. The caveat and I think the thing that's actually one of the more effective pieces of this is we require that click to come from the same IP that the login attempt came from. Right, so that if you're an attacker, right, and you steal username, password, TOTP, you're logging in from your IP. You're not logging in from the user's IP, right? Unless you can get that device verification link, the credentials you have are basically useless at that point, right? Now we do see attackers trying to innovate around that, right? So this is a device. This is another phish kit that includes a device verification bypass. It's basically asking a user to, instead of clicking that link in the email, copy and paste it into that form for reasons that they explain on the page. This is a pretty high bar for most users. This is very unsuccessful. But what it does demonstrate is these attackers are incredibly creative, and they're not seeing us make a move and they say, well, good game, Coinbase, we're going somewhere else, right? They're looking at ways to innovate around our innovations, which is really interesting. Credential stuffing. You all see this. Everyone on the internet sees this literally constantly, right? So nothing new. And because we require 2FA for all accounts, this is basically useless on Coinbase, right? So why are they doing it to me? Like, why do I still see credential stuffing runs? There's actually real costs there, right? There's cost to run the botnet. There's opportunity costs. They could be doing something else with that botnet. We're tracking today somewhere around half a dozen botnets that are fairly active Coinbase credential stuffers, right? So like, why? Well, we'll get into that a little bit later. Specifically though, if you don't require 2FA everywhere, what we've seen here is they're global, they're everywhere, they're in almost every country. They're extremely good at evading rate limiting. That's a classical credential stuffing countermeasure. They're extremely good at detecting and running right below the threshold for a rate limiting action, right? So in fact, one of the interesting things we've started to see on the botnet side is the proliferation of IoT devices in these botnets. So we recently ID'd a toaster trying to log into Coinbase. And look, I'm all for driving broad access to cryptocurrency. Like, I want adoption to be as high as possible. But I really worry that if we give toasters access to cryptocurrency, we're just going to start down Sky. We're going to end up with Skynet like tomorrow, right? So we didn't let them in. Toaster did not get cryptocurrency. You're all welcome. We're going to live a little bit longer. So how can you also help us stave off the machine revolution, right? So rate limiting does help. Rate limiting does make them work harder. It does make them slow down, and it does make them use up more resources. But if an attacker cares enough about you, they can absolutely do it. We see most of the botnets that are coming at Coinbase, we see between 3 and 4 requests per IP total during the entire run of the credential stuffing, right? So from a rate limiting perspective, that's a pretty low bar, and it's a pretty, like, you're not going to put a rate limiting threshold that low, more than likely. Similarly, like country level or ASN level blocking can be helpful sometimes. It depends a lot on your platform and where your users are. For us in 103 countries, it's a little bit harder to do that really effectively without impacting users in a way we just don't want to. Okay. CAPTCHA is another common pitch here, and for platforms that don't have an API, they don't have to support an API with login capabilities. So if you're not supporting a native mobile app, for example, and don't have to deal with that, CAPTCHA can actually be quite nice in this context. If you are supporting a native mobile app or are supporting flows that require an API-based login, it becomes much harder to implement CAPTCHA, reCAPTCHA. And for all of the vendors who are going to email me later about their amazing reCAPTCHA solution, just please don't. That would be great. Let's see. There are also like probably 100 companies at this point that'll sell you, bot detection, bot mitigation in various ways. They're going to work better or worse depending on the details of your platform and your like specific attackers. I'm not going to go into any of those. If you want, there's the business hall right down they'll tell you all about all of that stuff, right? Ultimately, 2FA is the solution that works here, that works uniformly, that works super, super well, right? Like I said, we require 2FA for every single user on Coinbase. So I want to talk a little bit about that and sort of some of the challenges that creates and how we're able to do it effectively. Because I hope that over time that becomes more normalized. I'm gonna talk about this a little bit later, but today, if you went and tried to log into a site and they said, you know what, we actually don't have a password because we don't think we think that's too much friction. Most people's response would be, that's crazy. What are you doing, right? But that's essentially what a lot of platforms are saying about 2FA. It's too much friction. We don't want to push it on the user. They're not going to use the service. It's going to impact the sales funnel, whatever it is. And I think we have to get past that and do a place where we're normalizing 2FA to say, it's crazy not to. Like, why aren't you? Should be the question. Not like, why are you making me do this? That's a big blue sky. That's a lot of work to get there, but I think it's where we have to get long term. Like I said, 30 million users, global. We have lots of interesting challenges with our user base. Like I said, we default to SMS 2FA. So as you're coming in, as you're registering with Coinbase, we ask for your phone number. It's both part of our KYC requirements, and we auto enroll you in 2FA, right? The challenge, as I mentioned, is convincing users to move sort of up the ladder. We talked about how we're doing prompts, about the in-app prompt thing. We've also done a lot of work on sort of how we talk to users about 2FA, both in terms of like knowledge base and help articles, and tried to provide a really to the extent possible frictionless experience to users who are using 2FA. Right? I think a lot of users are sort of scared. There are some cultural issues as well. There are some technology issues across the board. Delivering 2FA in Uganda is very different than delivering 2FA in New York, right? So there's a lot of regionality to this that needs to be explored if you're a global platform. So if attackers aren't getting into accounts, right? Why are they credential stuffing? I asked this earlier and said I was going to talk about it. And they're doing it because it's not actually credential stuffing, it's list validation, right? They're reselling these lists in ATO forums and other sort of dark market style venues to other folks that are executing more targeted ATO tactics, right? I don't want that, right? That's exactly what I don't want to have happen in the world. So we thought about this a lot. We said, okay, I think we can build a system that starts to identify some of these ATO runs, and we do based on things like login attempt velocity, some user agent stuff, some header order discrepancies, things like that, where you can start to detect, hey, this is odd, this is strange, this is maybe a credential stuffing campaign. And when we do that, we feed back statistically probable lies, right? So we took a look at sort of what the success rates were for credential stuffing runs across the board. By success, I mean they got a prompt that said enter your 2FA, right? So what percentage of folks of these passwords are actually good? In the work we did for our site, it was about 2.5%, right? Came back as like, okay, that's the right email credential pair. So again, when we flag these and create these sort of identifiers for these credential stuffing campaigns, we then track the responses to that and we give them back about 2.5% success, right? Completely randomly, with no basis in reality. The intent of this, beyond it, makes us laugh and sort of fun, is to impact their economic reputation, right? When they go resell that list somewhere else and say, hey, this is a validated Coinbase user list, that my seller rating on whatever market is going to go down over time because you're reselling crap. And we've actually done the work to go, like when we see ATO forum dumps, OG users was a good example, but there have been a number of others. We go crawling through that and we look for evidence this is actually being successful, right? And we've seen we've seen seller reputation decline as they were selling junk lists that came from this process, which was awesome. And exactly what we wanted to do, right? We wanted to dissuade folks from engaging in that behavior on Coinbase. Now you might be asking yourself, why are you saying this? Because now they know what you're doing. It's been going on for 3 years. We've seen their behavior change. They figured it out, right? They have tripped to this at this point. And there's a sort of a cat and mouse game. We saw them doing things like, as they started to suspect, doing the credential stuffing runs multiple times with the same accounts, looking for discrepancies in output, including known good, known bad logins, things like that, to try to detect when we were spoofing them. And sort of we've gone back and forth over time into like, addressing those, and they've figured out new ones, things like that. And so really the marginal benefit here has declined a fair bit for us. And so we'll do other things in the future, not this one. We really wanted to open source the tooling, but when we went and looked and spent time, it's so deeply embedded in our systems that pulling it out is almost meaningless to bring out into the world. So we'd love to do it at some point. Hopefully we will. Let's talk social engineering. I think I'm right about on time here. Yep, perfect. So this is the most common account takeover technique that we see, by far. It's low tech, it's low risk. You can do it remotely, it's fairly easy to do. It works depressingly well on a broad swath of people. So we used to see the classical sort of tech support style scams, the cold calling scams, where there's a call center somewhere, they're calling almost literally random numbers and saying, hey, I'm calling from Coinbase about your problem. You have a problem, right? And if you say, no, I don't have a problem, they'll say, oh, I'm also Amazon support. I'm calling about that. Do you have a problem there? And they'll just literally have listened to recorded conversations where they pivoted between 4 or 5 different brands as someone said, I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem. Oh yeah, I got a problem there. Can you help me with that one? So we don't see those as much anymore in the cryptocurrency side, right? I think for a couple of reasons. Number one, the FTC has been very, very aggressive in shutting down these call centers and actually creating real consequences. That's been great. But also it's a grind. It's a low success percentage because you're cold calling, right? If any of you have ever worked in marketing or thought about marketing effectively, the worst thing you can do is cold outreach, right? You just get hang-ups all day long. It's very frustrating, low return on investment, not great. So what we started to see attackers do is try to bring victims to them rather than them going to the victim, right? So the first experiments we saw attackers do here was around social engineering and public knowledge bases. Sorry, not social engineering, was social media and public knowledge bases, right? Using Twitter, using Facebook to put out fake phone support scam numbers or other sort of social engineering related stuff to say, hey, if you got a problem, this is the official Coinbase support number, the official Gemini support number, the official Kraken support number, or whatever, right? The knowledge bases they were using to do SEO basically. So they would find a knowledge base that's on a popular site that's open, right? So these are things where companies are allowing users to support each other by creating content in their knowledge base. And instead of supporting each other, they would create pages on these knowledge bases to say that the official support number for brand X is this. And you saw it not just in cryptocurrency, but across the board, almost every major brand. And that worked better, quite frankly. What that means is that instead of cold calling users who may or may not be Coinbase users or a user of any one brand, what they're doing is they're creating a funnel to bring users to them who they know are already customers of that brand, because why else would they be out there searching for this information, and who probably have some sort of problem they need addressed, right? From a marketing perspective, this is a much better flow of potential leads than cold calling out to a bunch of random people. So once the user actually is in contact with social engineer, there are different flavors of this, but like the basic process boils down to install this screen sharing application, log into the targeted brand, take control of the screen, perform the malicious action, and done, right? It's really, really straightforward flow after you bring the user to you. I'm going to talk a little bit later about a few of the other methods we see we see attackers using to bring victims to them. In fact, let's go ahead and do that right now. So two things that we've seen attackers playing with that's really, really interesting. One is answer box pollution. So the answer box, the screenshot up there is for Google, but most of the search engines have a similar feature, right? We have seen over time attackers experimenting with creating pages like on the upper right up there, which is a totally benign, non-malicious page, copy lifted directly from the Coinbase website or from the Wikipedia article on Coinbase. The only thing about that page that's different is the phone number is different, or was different before. The phone number went to a scam call center. Is the only thing that's different about that page. Right? We've seen attackers try to inject these more and more because the answer box solutions are generally looking for exactly that. Well-formatted, seemingly authoritative sources to sort of compute what's the right answer, right? I think the one below it, the maps locations, is also interesting. We see it, again, that's a Google screenshot, but we see it across basically all the maps functions. What's nice about this is when you search on Google or Yahoo or wherever, and the search engine thinks it knows where you are, it'll pop up contextually relevant locations that might answer your search, right? Great. What the attackers did is they created a bunch of fake locations for Coinbase, fake Coinbase offices in the map, that populated with, again, scam phone numbers, right? So that when you search, that pops up sort of 3/4 of the way up the screen, right? You get like the ads on the top, you get like 3 real results, you get the maps right there, right front and center, right? When I saw that, I had to give the attacker sort of a golf clap. Like, that was a great idea. And for a defender, it's harder to detect because these searches only come up when they're locationally relevant. All right, so we actually wrote a bunch of search scraping stuff at spoof locations so we could transport ourselves around the world and search for these things and start to take them down. But the theme for these two things is even more so than when we talked about the Twitter and the knowledge base is these attackers are looking to poison the information that users are using to make decisions, right? They've gone from cold calling to posting targeted ads, basically, whether it's social media or whatever, to trying to poison the body of information users leverage to figure out what they should be doing. And I think it's a brilliant tactic, and it's extremely dangerous from a defensive perspective. So what do we do? So we do two things. Number one, we're incredibly aggressive in takedowns. Sites, social media, everything we can take down, we take down as soon as possible. This is sort of like harm reduction, right? We want to stem the bleeding as much as possible, so that fewer users are impacted. Second thing we do, or we're doing, I should say, is a lot of work on sort of screen sharing detection. That's sort of the commonality in how this exploitation occurs, is at some point a screen sharing app gets installed. Some success, some failures, depends on the app that's being used. There's some interesting stuff we're seeing in mouse movements differences and in keystroke timing differences that we think might be a generic fingerprint we can use, but it's an area we're sort of actively exploring. I'm going to skip through malware pretty quick for two reasons. Number one, it's not that interesting. The story I want to tell with this is not, yes, banking malware is pivoting to target cryptocurrency companies. That's probably not a shock. The fun thing though is how some of them are doing it. So this is the graphic there is a screenshot of a web page for a clone of a secure browser called CryptoSecure. That the attackers made the clone, and then they made it. It's actually malware. Surprise, surprise. But what they did is that little green box down there, right? So that's actually a picture scraped from LinkedIn of the guy who runs my security ops team. They ginned up a fake quote attributed to him. We know that because he has much better grammar than this quote has. And then they scraped a bunch of content off of some security blogs we'd written, right? So the interesting thing about this is the level of investment they're putting into targeting this directly at users of given platforms and creating that sense of trust by leveraging, if you go research, who is this Matt Mueller guy? Oh, he works at Coinbase, he runs security operations. That seems like a guy you would trust to say things about this, right? Really, really interesting, and not something I commonly see or commonly seen across malware previously. Right? Countermeasures for malware, it's all the same stuff that you do for banking malware. There's nothing like shockingly new here. So bottom line, and I'm going to end up right on time, which is outstanding. I don't know which of these techniques is going to trickle down. I don't know when it's going to happen. It may be techniques that aren't on here yet. It may become widespread or not. But I have overall high confidence that if you're running a consumer-facing application, you will start to see some of these techniques trickle down over time, and they will start to impact your users. That's the intent of coming up here and talking about this, is to give you guys a view into sort of what we're seeing with that belief in mind. Right? Number two, we have to, as an industry, invest in normalizing 2FA. Not deploying 2FA, not rolling out 2FA, normalizing 2FA so that it is just as obvious and required as a password in folks' minds, right? That's the only way I think we're gonna start to really see a lasting and durable victory in this game. And last thing I'll note is talking to a diverse global population about security is actually super hard. And not well researched, right? How do you deliver a security message in Japan and in New York and in London? How do you tweak them? How are they different? How do they need to be? How do they need to be adjusted? Right. So I hope I can present some work in this area later. But I would also call for other large platforms that have done this in the past to make some of this stuff public. Right. This is really, really important. The way we talk to users about security has to evolve and has to become more targeted. With that, if you guys want to start, if you have questions, start queuing up. And I hope this has been a useful view into how we see ATO. I hope you walk away with an idea or two that you can use, or at least an area to research for your organization. And last thing, my team would kill me if I didn't mention we're hiring. We're hiring in literally everything. So if this sounds like a really fun problem set for you guys, either hit me up afterwards or coinbase.com/careers. Thank you all very much.
Hello, I do have a question. So it seems like you're aware when you block an attack, but if an attack goes through and the user does lose money, and it's clear that this was a type of cyber theft, how does Coinbase respond? Do you guys have some insurance, or is it the user's just out of luck? Or? So
we look at it on a case-by-case basis around like what actually happened, right? Is this like AWS? We think about this in sort of a shared responsibility model, and we try to, as best we can, apportion like, okay, yep, our controls failed. That was our fault. We'll make you whole. Look, you typed your password into a phishing site and ignored our alerts for 3 days. Like there's a shared responsibility there.
Okay.
I was curious if you could say anything about current adoption of physical tokens like YubiKey and how you think those are going to roll out in the future. Thank you.
Yep. So right now we released YubiKey or more broadly WebAuthn support for Coinbase. I want to say it was 2 or 3 months ago. We see about 1% adoption right now across the user base. But that's fairly organic. We haven't pushed it very hard. So that's pretty organic uptake at this point. So as we start to push campaigns around it and start to actively push users into that funnel, we think it will go up quite a fair bit.
I have another question.
Shoot.
So do you have any insight into which phone service providers are more or less susceptible to SIM swapping? Maybe, I don't know if you, maybe you shouldn't name any particular ones. I'm not sure. Maybe,
I'll tell you my positive recommendation.
Sure.
And instead of this. So Google Fi is really, really good.
Okay.
Around SIM swapping and phone porting.
Cool. I use it. That's one reason that I like it.
Outstanding.
Hi, I didn't catch how you found out that the fake Coinbase locations existed.
I actually don't recall how we found that out. I don't recall.
Okay. Are
Sorry.
you like scanning like to see if those pop up, right?
It was almost certainly we were looking at search results related to Coinbase. We do a lot of monitoring of like what results are showing up in searches for Coinbase we care about.
Sure.
It was almost certainly we were doing one of those and happened to see one and then started digging and discovered the broader problem.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So there are some carriers in other countries that actually have APIs where you can actually see how recently a SIM
Yep.
was changed. Why don't we have that here?
That is a wonderful question, and I wish I knew the answer to that. I would love it if we did. There are actually some initiatives to build things like that here, but nothing that's actually landed yet. So I hope it does in the future. It'd make my life way easier.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
On one of the earlier slides, you mentioned that timed one-time passwords can be cracked. Can you just give us an idea of how that attack might work?
Yep, so not cracked, stolen or bypassed, right? So what we see most commonly is either, as I mentioned, sort of the credential theft stuff, right? That has an integrated TOTP theft function, right? Or the other thing we see commonly is as attackers gain access to Gmail and targeted attacks, one of the things they search for right up front are TOTP seeds and backup codes. It's part of their standard search playbook. I'm getting a red light. I gotta get down. If you guys have more questions, happy to take them offline. Thank you all very much.